The M1 Carbine had become an extension of Audie Murphy's frozen hands during 3 weeks in the Vosges Mountains, where January 1945 stretched like an endless vigil through snow-choked forests and German counterattacks that came with clockwork precision. The weapon's familiar weight offered the only constant in a sector where foxholes froze solid overnight, and the 3rd Infantry Division's positions shifted like chess pieces across the eastern French ridgelines. Murphy crouched behind the stone wall of what had once been the Dubois farmhouse, watching steam rise from his breath as he studied the road junction below. A disabled tank destroyer sat at an awkward angle where the main route curved toward Holtzwihr, its hull blackened from a direct hit 2 days earlier. The crew had been evacuated, but the vehicle's deck guns remained intact, a detail that registered in Murphy's mind with the same automatic precision he applied to counting remaining ammunition or calculating fields of fire. The morning's reconnaissance patrol had turned into something else entirely when Lieutenant Harrison's platoon walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush. German infantry had scattered the American force across 2 miles of frozen farmland, leaving Murphy as the senior non-commissioned officer with 11 frightened soldiers looking to him for answers that felt increasingly impossible to provide. The radio operator, Corporal Jenkins, had taken shrapnel in the opening exchange, severing their connection to company headquarters and the artillery support that might have evened the odds. Private Morrison crawled over from the collapsed barn, his teenage face pale beneath a helmet liner decorated with a fading photograph of his girlfriend back in Iowa. The kid moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that careless noise could draw fire, but his eyes carried the same question Murphy had been seeing for months. "What do we do now, Sarge?" "They're moving up through the tree line again," Morrison whispered, gesturing toward the forest beyond the road junction. "Maybe a full squad, maybe more. They know we're here." Murphy nodded, his attention divided between the immediate tactical problem and something larger that had been gnawing at him since Sicily. The newspapers back home had started writing about him in ways that felt disconnected from the reality of frozen fingers and ammunition shortages. Hero stories that made combat sound like a series of clear choices between right and wrong, when the truth was usually a matter of choosing between bad options and hoping you could live with the consequences. Through the gap in the farmhouse wall, he could see movement in the tree line 300 yards away. The Germans were taking their time, probably waiting for additional troops before launching their final assault. His men were spread throughout the ruins, some behind an overturned wagon, others in what remained of the kitchen, where Madame Dubois had probably prepared meals for her family before the war turned her home into a tactical position. The sound of boots crunching through snow was getting closer. Murphy checked his carbine's 15-round magazine, 12 shots remaining. Not nearly enough for what was coming, but it would have to be sufficient for what he was beginning to consider. The disabled tank destroyer sat at the road junction like a piece of abandoned equipment, but Murphy found himself studying its position with renewed interest, calculating angles and distances with the same methodical approach that had kept him alive through 3 campaigns. "How much ammunition do we have total?" he asked Morrison quietly. "Maybe 40 rounds between all of us," the private replied. "And no clear way out. They've got the road covered, and the fields behind us are wide open." Murphy looked at the kid's face and saw the trust that had become both a burden and a responsibility heavier than any equipment he'd ever carried. The men expected him to find a solution because he always had before. They didn't know that each impossible situation felt more impossible than the last, or that the newspaper stories made it harder to admit when he was genuinely afraid. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The German advance resumed with methodical precision, soldiers moving in short rushes between the sparse cover of winter-bare trees and farm equipment. Murphy counted at least 15 infantry, supported by what sounded like a light machine gun positioned somewhere beyond his line of sight. The Vosges Mountains had taught both sides to use terrain carefully. Every ridge and forest clearing had changed hands multiple times since December, leaving the landscape scarred with foxholes and abandoned positions that told stories of earlier battles. Sergeant Williams moved carefully along the collapsed wall, keeping low as he approached Murphy's position. Williams had been with the 3rd Infantry Division since North Africa, and his weathered face carried the particular exhaustion of men who had seen too many farmhouses turned into fortified positions, too many road junctions that became the focal point of someone's last stand. "They've got us bracketed," Williams said quietly. "Machine gun teams setting up on the left flank, rifle squad moving to cut off the road behind us. Classic textbook stuff." Murphy studied the disabled tank destroyer through his binoculars, noting details that hadn't seemed important when they had first taken shelter in the farmhouse ruins. The vehicle's main gun was damaged, but the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret appeared intact. More importantly, the tank destroyer's position commanded clear fields of fire across the entire approach route the Germans would have to use. "What do you think about that TD down there?" Murphy asked, keeping his voice casual. Williams followed his gaze and shook his head immediately. "It's a death trap. No cover, no support, and that hull's already taken one direct hit. Besides, even if the gun works, you'd be completely exposed." The calculation forming in Murphy's mind felt both inevitable and impossible. Someone would have to create enough noise and confusion to allow the rest of the squad to withdraw through the forest toward friendly lines. It wasn't the kind of plan that included survival for whoever stayed behind, but it was the only option that gave the others a realistic chance. Private Rodriguez crawled over from the kitchen ruins, dragging his rifle and a canvas bag containing their remaining ammunition. Rodriguez had joined the unit as a replacement 3 weeks earlier, fresh from training camps in Georgia, and he still jumped at the sound of incoming artillery. But he had proven steady under fire, and Murphy had noticed the way the other men looked to Rodriguez when they needed someone to volunteer for the dangerous jobs. "Sarge, they're definitely setting up for a coordinated assault," Rodriguez reported. "I can hear them talking in the woods. They know exactly how many of us there are." Murphy nodded, his attention focused on the tactical puzzle that combat always became: limited resources, imperfect information, and decisions that would determine who walked away and who didn't. The M1 carbine felt unnaturally light in his hands as he considered the variables. 15 rounds of semi-automatic fire could create the impression of multiple defenders if positioned correctly. The tank destroyer's machine gun would multiply that effect dramatically, assuming it could be reached and assuming it still functioned. "Williams, how long would you need to get the men back through the forest to our original positions?" 20 minutes if we move fast and don't run into any more of them," Williams replied. "But somebody would have to keep their attention focused here, make them think we're still defending the farmhouse in strength." The sound of German voices carried clearly in the cold air, punctuated by the metallic click of weapons being readied for assault. Murphy looked around at the faces of his men, some barely 19, others veteran non-commissioned officers who had followed him through Sicily and Italy. Each of them represented someone's son, someone's brother, someone who wrote letters home about surviving the war and returning to jobs or farms or college educations that the fighting had interrupted. The disabled tank destroyer sat at the road junction like an artifact from an earlier battle, its blackened hull a reminder of how quickly situations could change. But Murphy found himself calculating the distance, the available cover during approach, and the fields of fire that would be available from the turret position. The mathematics of the situation were brutal in their simplicity. One man in the right position could hold the German advance long enough for 11 others to reach safety. The sound of artillery rumbled from somewhere to the north, where other elements of the 3rd Infantry Division were holding defensive positions along the ridgelines that controlled access to the Alsatian plain. Murphy listened to the distant thunder with the practiced ear of someone who had learned to distinguish between outgoing fire and incoming rounds, between the sharp crack of tank guns and the deeper rumble of heavy mortars. The Vosges mountains amplified and distorted sound in ways that could save your life or get you killed, depending on how accurately you read the audio landscape. Private Morrison returned from a brief reconnaissance of the barn ruins, moving with the careful economy of motion that separated veterans from replacements. His report confirmed what Murphy already suspected. The Germans had positioned additional forces to cut off any retreat toward the main road, leaving the forest route as the only viable escape path. "They're good," Morrison said quietly. "Professional. They've done this before." Sergeant Williams distributed the remaining ammunition with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this ritual too many times. 8 rounds for Murphy's carbine, 6 for Morrison's rifle, scattered clips and loose rounds for the others. Not enough for a sustained firefight, but sufficient for the kind of brief, intense engagement that would accompany any withdrawal attempt. Murphy found himself thinking about the newspaper stories that had begun following him since his actions in Italy. The articles described heroic stands and impossible odds, overcome through courage and tactical brilliance, but they never captured the actual feeling of making these decisions. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than fear, and the mathematics of combat were always brutally simple. Someone had to pay the price for everyone else's survival. "Sarge, what's the plan?" Rodriguez asked, checking his rifle's action with movements that had become automatic after 3 weeks of constant contact. The disabled tank destroyer dominated the road junction like a piece of abandoned chess equipment, its turret traversed to cover the main approach from the German positions. Murphy had been studying the vehicle for 10 minutes, calculating approach routes and fields of fire with the same careful attention he applied to every tactical problem. The .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret represented firepower that could hold an entire rifle company at bay if it still functioned and if someone could reach it alive. Williams followed his gaze and shook his head again. "It's suicide, Murphy. That hull's already been hit once, and you'd be completely exposed. Even if you made it to the turret, you'd have no way out." Murphy understood the logic, but the mathematics of their situation allowed for only one solution. The Germans were positioning for a final assault that would overwhelm the farmhouse position within minutes. His squad needed 20 minutes to reach safety through the forest. 20 minutes that someone would have to purchase with firepower positioned to convince the enemy they were facing a stronger defense than actually existed. The sound of movement in the tree line was getting closer, punctuated by whispered commands in German and the distinctive metallic sounds of weapons being prepared for assault. Murphy looked around at the faces of his men and saw the same expression he had been carrying for months. The quiet acceptance that some situations required impossible choices, and that leadership meant being willing to make those choices when everyone else's survival depended on it. "Here's what we're going to do," he said quietly, gathering the men around him in the shelter of the collapsed wall. "Williams, you're going to take everyone out through the barn, then straight back through the forest to our original lines. Stay together, move fast, and don't stop to fight unless you absolutely have to." "What about you?" Morrison asked, though his expression suggested he already understood the answer. Murphy checked his carbine one final time, noting the familiar weight and balance that had become as natural as his own heartbeat. The disabled tank destroyer sat 150 yards away across open ground that would be covered by German fire within minutes. It was the kind of distance that could be covered in a desperate sprint, but only if timing and luck aligned in ways that rarely happened in combat. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy waited until his men had disappeared through the gap in the barn wall before beginning his sprint across the open ground toward the disabled tank destroyer. The Vosges mountains seemed to hold their breath around him as he covered the 150 yards in sections, using scattered farm equipment and shell craters for momentary cover. Behind him, he could hear German voices growing more urgent as they prepared for their assault on what they believed was a fully defended farmhouse position. The tank destroyer's hull bore the scars of its earlier encounter, blackened metal and twisted armor plate that told the story of a direct hit from German anti-tank guns. But as Murphy hauled himself onto the deck, he discovered that the turret mechanism still functioned, and the 50 caliber machine gun remained intact. More importantly, the vehicle's position commanded perfect fields of fire across every approach route the German infantry would have to use. The machine gun's ammunition boxes held approximately 200 rounds of linked 50 caliber ammunition, enough firepower to hold an entire company at bay if used correctly. Murphy tested the weapon's traverse and elevation controls, finding them damaged but functional. From the turret position, he could see German soldiers moving through the tree line, preparing for what they expected to be a final assault on a handful of frightened American infantry. The first burst from the 50 caliber caught the German advance completely by surprise. Murphy had positioned the gun to cover the main approach route, and the heavy machine gun's distinctive sound echoed across the frozen landscape like thunder. German soldiers dove for cover as 50 caliber rounds shredded the winter bare trees around them, turning their organized assault into confused, scrambling for survival. Murphy shifted fire between target areas, creating the impression of multiple machine gun positions. The tank destroyer's elevation allowed him to see over terrain features that had concealed German movement, and he used that advantage to disrupt their coordination. Return fire began immediately, rifle shots and machine gun bursts that rang against the tank destroyer's armor like hail on a metal roof. The psychological effect of the heavy machine gun was as important as its actual firepower. German infantry had approached the farmhouse expecting to overwhelm a handful of rifle-armed defenders, but now they faced what appeared to be a prepared defensive position with crew-served weapons. Their assault momentum collapsed as squad leaders tried to reorganize under fire that seemed to come from multiple directions. Murphy rationed his ammunition carefully, firing measured bursts that maximized psychological impact while conserving rounds for the sustained engagement he knew was coming. The Germans would recover from their initial surprise, identify his actual position, and coordinate their response. He estimated 15 minutes before they could organize effective counterfire, more than enough time for his squad to reach safety, but probably not enough for his own survival. A German machine gun team had set up in the tree line and began directing accurate fire at the tank destroyer's turret. Bullets sparked off the armor around Murphy's position, and he felt the concussion of near misses against the steel plate that provided his only protection. The enemy had identified his location and was beginning to coordinate their response with the methodical precision that characterized German infantry tactics. Murphy continued firing measured bursts, shifting position within the limited space of the turret to avoid becoming a predictable target. The 50 caliber's range and penetration allowed him to engage targets that his carbine could never have reached, and he used that advantage to disrupt German attempts to reorganize their assault. Each burst bought additional time for his men's withdrawal, but also drew more concentrated fire onto his position. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear. He had perhaps 5 more minutes before German fire would make the turret position untenable. The tank destroyer's armor provided protection from rifle fire, but it would not withstand direct hits from German anti-tank weapons that were certainly being brought forward. Murphy found himself calculating escape routes with the same methodical approach he applied to every tactical problem, knowing that his options were diminishing with each passing minute. The German mortar round landed 20 yards from the tank destroyer, close enough to shower Murphy with frozen earth and metal fragments. He ducked below the turret rim as more rounds impacted around his position, part of a coordinated effort to neutralize what the enemy had correctly identified as the key to American resistance. The Vosges Mountains amplified the explosions into rolling thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath the disabled vehicle. What the official after-action report would never capture was the moment when Murphy's ammunition ran low, and he realized that his carefully calculated plan had one fatal flaw. He had no realistic way to withdraw from the tank destroyer's position. The German infantry had recovered from their initial surprise and was now advancing with the methodical precision that characterized veteran troops. He could see soldiers moving through the forest in coordinated rushes, using terrain and mutual support to close the distance despite his defensive fire. Murphy shifted to his M1 carbine as the machine gun's ammunition was exhausted, but the lighter weapon felt inadequate after the psychological impact of the .50 caliber. German soldiers were now close enough that he could see their faces, young men like himself, following orders in a war that had taken them far from home. Some looked determined, others frightened, but all of them moved with the competence that came from months of combat experience in the difficult terrain of eastern France. The central secret that no citation would ever record was the moment when Murphy's courage faltered completely. As German infantry closed to within 50 yards of the tank destroyer, he found himself paralyzed not by fear of death, but by the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had miscalculated. His squad should have reached safety by now, but he could still hear gunfire from the direction of their withdrawal route. Either they had encountered additional German forces, or his sacrifice was proving insufficient to ensure their escape. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, Murphy crouched in the tank destroyer's turret and experienced the kind of complete breakdown that combat veterans never discussed in later years. The weight of responsibility, accumulated over months of impossible decisions, seemed to crush him against the steel deck. He found himself unable to move, unable to think clearly, unable to perform any of the actions that had earned him his reputation as someone who could function under pressure. The sound that brought him back was Private Morrison's voice, carried on the wind from somewhere in the forest behind the German positions. The kid was calling for covering fire, which meant the squad was still fighting and still needed the diversion that Murphy's position could provide. The mathematics of the situation remained brutally simple. His men were still in danger, and he was the only one positioned to help them. Murphy rose above the turret rim and resumed firing with his carbine, using single-aimed shots to conserve his remaining ammunition while maintaining pressure on the German advance. The enemy soldiers were close enough now that he could see their individual equipment and facial expressions, but he forced himself to focus on mechanical tasks, sight alignment, trigger control, target selection. The breakdown had lasted less than a minute, but it had shown him something about himself that would remain buried in official reports. German return fire was intensifying as more troops arrived to support the assault. Murphy could hear the distinctive crack of Mauser rifles mixing with the chatter of machine guns, and he felt the impact of near misses against the tank destroyer's armor. The enemy had identified his exact position and was concentrating their fire with the kind of precision that indicated veteran troops led by experienced non-commissioned officers. The irony that would haunt Murphy for decades was that his moment of complete breakdown had lasted longer than many of the heroic actions that would earn him medals and newspaper coverage. The real test of character hadn't been his ability to function under fire, but his capacity to continue functioning after experiencing the kind of fear and doubt that could paralyze anyone. What the citations would describe as unwavering courage had actually been a series of small decisions to keep moving, despite overwhelming reasons to stop. The sound of American artillery finally reached the road junction as Murphy fired his last carbine round, the familiar whistle of incoming friendly fire that meant someone had re-established radio contact with battalion headquarters. The German assault faltered as 105mm shells began impacting in the tree line, forcing enemy soldiers to seek cover and disrupting their coordinated advance. Murphy used the confusion to begin his own withdrawal from the tank destroyer, moving carefully across open ground while German attention was focused on the artillery barrage. Sergeant Williams appeared at the edge of the forest, leading the remnants of the squad back toward Murphy's position, now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Williams's face carried the particular exhaustion of men who had spent 20 minutes fighting their way through German patrols, buying their own survival with careful movement and occasional violent encounters that left both sides diminished. "We lost Rodriguez," Williams reported quietly as Murphy reached the shelter of the tree line. "Machine gun nest we didn't see. Kid never had a chance." Murphy nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that accompanied every tactical decision. Rodriguez had been 19 years old, fresh from Georgia training camps, and he had died because Murphy's plan to cover their withdrawal had proven insufficient. The mathematics of combat were always brutal in their accounting. Some men walked away, others didn't, and the reasons often had more to do with luck than heroism. The official after-action report, written 3 days later in the warmth of battalion headquarters, would describe the engagement in clean, precise language that transformed the chaos of combat into neat categories of success and failure. Murphy's actions would be summarized as exceptional courage under fire and initiative that prevented the loss of an entire squad. The report would mention the disabled tank destroyer and the defensive fire that had disrupted German assault plans, but it would not capture the moment when his nerve had broken or the way Rodriguez's death had felt like a personal failure. Private Morrison walked beside Murphy as they moved through the forest toward friendly lines, carrying his rifle with the careful attention that combat veterans applied to their equipment. The kid had aged visibly during the engagement, and Murphy recognized the particular expression that appeared on soldiers' faces after their first close encounter with the kind of decisions that left permanent marks on memory. "Sarge," Morrison said quietly, "what do we tell Rodriguez's family?" Murphy considered the question as they navigated through the Vosges Mountains terrain that had become as familiar as any landscape from his Texas childhood. The official letter would mention honor and sacrifice and service to country, but those words felt inadequate when measured against the reality of a 19-year-old who would never return to his girlfriend in Iowa. The war would end eventually, but some of its costs would continue accumulating for decades in the memories of those who survived. 23 years later, Murphy would be sitting in a Hollywood office discussing a movie script based on his war experiences, and the screenwriters would ask him to describe his feelings during the tank destroyer engagement. He would provide them with the clean, heroic narrative they expected, but he would never mention the 30 seconds when he had been unable to move, or the way Rodriguez's death had felt like a mathematical equation that balanced out incorrectly. The M1 Carbine would be cleaned and inspected that evening in the relative safety of company positions, its metal surfaces wiped free of the condensation that formed during rapid temperature changes. The weapon had functioned perfectly throughout the engagement, as it always did, but Murphy would find himself thinking about the disabled tank destroyer and wondering how many other soldiers had discovered the difference between the courage they thought they possessed and the kind they actually needed. The smell of diesel fuel and winter air would trigger memories for the rest of his life. Sudden, involuntary returns to that road junction in the Vosges Mountains where he had learned something about himself that no citation could capture. The legend would speak of unwavering heroism, but the memory would always include the moment when everything had nearly collapsed, and the knowledge that real courage was often a matter of continuing to function despite reasons to stop. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.